recognizing the minority leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to support the governor's veto. Obviously, many of us have argued against this bill. I want to point out a couple things before you today to remind you why we believe that this bill goes too far. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that Governor Hogan has been a firm believer and advocate for second chances. And like I think most people in this chamber believe that juveniles are capable of rehabilitation. The other day when I met with Governor Hogan, I asked him about this bill, or this process really. I said, what's it been like for you? And he told me that while he's been very proud to be able to give parole to more people than any other governor in recent history, you know, he's granted 7 paroles, 2 medical paroles, and 4 commutations for this particular population that this bill addresses. He also told me that he's very concerned about this for this reason. While he's been very liberal, unlike other governors in recent history on this issue, he told me that in many of the instances that he's received from the Commission advice to grant parole, in many of those instances he didn't grant it because psychiatrists said the individual was still a risk. And officials at the prison where the individual was incarcerated also argued against it despite the Paroles Commission advice to grant the parole. You know, I believe in second chances, and I believe in forgiveness, and I have in my life been the recipient of both, and I tried my best to give both. And I know that when you're young, you know, we make mistakes. Kids can make really bad, unthinkable mistakes. But I also know that there are some things that people do that are so horrible, so despicable, that they have to be met with both harsh consequences and, for the interests of public safety and the victims, sentences must be honored to protect all the rest of us. I want to make it incredibly clear that the crimes committed by some of the individuals that this bill could potentially let out of jail are scary. When we were debating this bill last week, the gentleman from Allegheny County talked about Nick Browning, who murdered his father, mother, 2 younger brothers in a cold and calculated manner. The minority whip talked about Donta Harris, who murdered Officer Amy Caprio, brutally running her over with an SUV. Unfortunately, these are just a few examples. And while it's not my style, I want to tell you about another case that's approximately 20 years old that the bill before us could potentially impact. Benjamin Harris, who's currently 35, was convicted of first-degree murder committed at the age of 16. In 1995, he murdered Sharon Edwards, a 28-year-old mother, whom he slashed and stabbed 26 times. Sharon Harris was the care provider in a cottage where Garris was residing on the property of Shepard Pratt. He tried unsuccessfully to set the cottage on fire, which would have endangered the lives of the other individuals residing at the cottage. Garrett confessed to the murder, telling police officers that Mrs. Edwards pled for her life. This bill before us could impact individuals like him. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole plus 50 years. So some of these people are troubling. And while statistics show that, I believe it was said 1% go on to commit new crimes, you know, there is a process in place currently that seems to be working to address the issues that the bill seems to want to address. However, I confess, this bill before us could have been a little different. And if it was a little different, it would have received more support. It's been said that other states have passed things like this. States that don't have the political makeup of Maryland have passed bills like this. But I believe it was done in a more sensitive way for victims, especially. And when crimes are so heinous, like a crime that involves rape and murder, they're excluded from the bills that have passed in other places. So as it relates to victims, which is one of the cruelest aspects of the bill that's before us, proponents of this bill, who I respect, especially the ones in this chamber, they talk about second chances. The problem is this legislation gives offenders 4 or more chances within 26 years, which with each parole hearing and judicial review, victims endure severe re-traumatization. So I think it just goes too far. It causes panic attacks, flashbacks, nightmares, reliving the brutal murders of their loved ones. You may have received a correspondence from a lady named Debbie Kemple. She wrote after the passage of this bill in an appeal to the governor to veto it. Debbie is a resident of Elk Ridge. She said, "My mother was murdered by a 16-year-old student she was tutoring in 1992 in Howard County. He methodically beat her up, raped and strangled her, dumped her body behind a high store in King's Contrivance, and left her there to die, while he stole her car for a joyride for some fast food and went and played basketball with his friends. He was sentenced to life without parole by a jury that convicted him of her horrendous and merciless murder. He has exercised his right to many appeals throughout the years, and all that has done has ended up with his sentence being upheld. But this legislation will mandate 3 more judicial reviews and parole eligibility, and 400 other dangerous and non-redeemable juvenile killers will receive that as well. Victims and families and friends will be re-victimized, etc., etc. Point out one final thing. In the governor's veto letter, there's a whole stack of state's attorneys' letters saying that this isn't the right way to go, and I want to read one of those very briefly to you now, the one from Montgomery County. The state's attorney in Montgomery County says, "While I support certain aspects of what's trying to be done here, he seeks a veto because I believe the structure of the bill that allows for 3 hearings over a number of years is unduly cruel to the victim or surviving family members." So we didn't have to do it this way. We could have done it in a way that was a little bit more sympathetic to the victims of these heinous crimes. It's cruel to the surviving family members, and it needs to be known that reconsiderations are fraught with tension, pain, and heartache. Clearly, the juvenile is entitled to a look back using the factors outlined by the drafters of this legislation. However, there must remain a balance between offenders and victims' rights. So finally, I just say, by giving an excessive number of second chances, the legislation forces victims to repeatedly relive violent crimes that destroyed their lives. The freedom of violent offenders is placed above the rights and consideration of the victims. And that is not fair, and that is not right. And this bill before us should have been vetoed, and I urge the body to sustain the governor's veto. Thank you, Madam Speaker.